What I hope this previous section has shown, and it can be a bit depressing or certainly a bit discouraging in some respects, is that our personal choices, especially our spending choices, have implications well beyond the things that we buy and the consequences as we experience them. The marketing, the supply chain, the sourcing of resources and so forth is very complex, even for a simple thing like shoes, or for a more complex thing like a mobile phone. The choices that we make are effectively a vote that we cast in favor of the things that we buy. And we don't just approve of the thing itself, but we approve in making that choice. We approve of the supply chain, everything that goes into the production of that item, the marketing, the distribution, the whole gamut, every aspect of what it takes to get that thing from its various parts into something that we've bought. We cast a vote in favor of that whole process by making that choice. And by making those choices, we reinforce a system that produces that thing. What we've seen is that sometimes we're reinforcing a system that isn't a very just system, that effectively exploits or takes advantage of other people who live subject to the choices or the economic dominance that suppliers or other people have over their lives. And if we knew all the details of those things, we wouldn't be very happy about the outcomes, the implications for the people who suffer the consequences on that end. But this is important. As much as those personal choices can have negative consequences, the great thing is they can also have positive consequences or outcomes that we would endorse, that we would be happy about. And that's the point. It's the willingness and the ability to start asking questions about what are the implications of the spending choices that we make. And very, very complex subject. I wouldn't encourage anyone to launch into this boots and all and try to make all of your spending choices at all times based on a very complex understanding of social justice and all the supply chains and everything that's involved in that. But it is important to take a few things. It can be very helpful to take a few things and ask the question, like the shoes I buy. What difference does it make buying one kind of shoes versus another to the people who make those shoes, supply them, distribute them, the marketing and so forth? Or something that's very close to my heart, coffee. Buying coffee, making choices about the kind of coffee that I buy and where it comes from, can actually begin to reflect a sensitivity and a concern for the people who grow and supply that coffee on their end of the supply chain. And that's part of, again, the biblical picture of what God talks about when he talks about not oppressing the poor. We can actually make those choices in a positive direction. Perhaps it's difficult to make all of the choices in that direction initially, but we can begin to make some choices in that direction. And the important thing about that isn't that we always get it right all the time, but it's what it does to us. We start to make choices driven more by a desire to practice justice by the things that we buy. And we get a growing sense of satisfaction out of the way that we use money. That shapes us. That begins to determine the kind of people we become. And that's very important to God. In a sense, that's exactly what God is looking for, shaping us and the kind of people that we're going to become, ultimately. Now, I'm going to tell a story, I think in some ways that, for me, captures a lot of the values and the point of this course. It comes from Ethiopia. Well, actually, it comes from the border area of Ethiopia and northern Kenya. I've had this story secondhand from an Ethiopian friend, so I can't verify all of the details, but in its essence, I think I've basically got it. There's a small town in the northern border area of Kenya, near the border with Ethiopia. And in that town, which is a predominantly Muslim area, very strongly Muslim Islamic area, there's a small community of Christians, of believers. And as they grew, they set apart a house in that village to become their church. And they developed the church, and gradually they had to add on to the house and to the compound because the number of believers was growing. All the time, they felt this sense of competition with the local mosque, which was just over the road. The mosque was much larger, and it had a minaret with loudspeakers in it. And 5 times a day, every time there was a call to prayer, that loudspeaker would open up with its call to the whole village to come pray. The believers in that church thought, what if we had our own loudspeaker? And every time that we have a service, we broadcast the gospel to the whole community, the village. So they saved money, they gathered, they took offerings, they set aside some of their surplus production and whatnot. And over the course of a couple of years, they raised enough money to get a fairly good sound system for their own little church. They installed the sound system, and then they embarked on this competition with the mosque for who could be the loudest in their village, in their town. As the believers started to broadcast their services to the community, the people in the mosque, they began to get louder. They began to beef up the amplification for their speakers, their sound system, and they got progressively louder. And it started to go back and forth, so that there was this competition for who could have the best and the loudest sound system. Now, this is a small village, and they're broadcasting, they're putting these calls to prayer and these sermons broadcast in terms of the volume well beyond the limits of the town by now, but it's become a bit of a competition. Now, for the people in the church to be able to afford the kind of sound system they had was quite a stretch, but they believed that this was God's provision for them as a people in order to be able to witness to the gospel to their community. A couple of years into this process, there was a raid. This village is not far from, it's in northern Kenya, near the border with Ethiopia, but also not far from the southern border with Somalia. A very lawless kind of area. There's a lot of banditry and cattle raiding and whatnot that takes place. And at one point, bandits, a large group of raiders, came through, and they actually attacked the village. And in the process, they destroyed part of the mosque, including the sound system for the mosque. And there was a general sense of fear and discouragement and concern in the village. One, that it could happen again, and two, that they had lost so much. And then the Christians in that community started praying about their own commitments. And one of the leaders in that church community particularly had a strong conviction, and he started to communicate with the others in asking them to pray about this. And the prayer was this: we have a sound system, and the Muslims has been destroyed. What if we gave our sound system to the mosque? Knowing that there was no way that they would easily be able to replace what had been very difficult for them to get in the first place. And as a church community, they came to a very strong consensus that that's exactly what God was calling them to do. Challenging, unexpected, but that was what they believed God was calling them to do. So they took their sound system, which was completely intact, the whole thing, and they offered it as a gift to the Muslims for their mosque to replace the one that had been destroyed. Now just step back for a minute and imagine the impact of that gesture in a village where there was this competition and tension between the larger Islamic community and the smaller evangelical Christian community. It had all kinds of amazing repercussions for that village, not the least of which was that it drew the people together in a way that meant that they were much better able to organize themselves to actually provide a kind of collective security for that village and for the people in that area. But what it did for the Christians, especially, is that it taught them something about generosity. Generosity in the way that God practices generosity, that they recognized they needed to learn and understand. They gave up something that was precious to them, but they did it willingly. They did it because they recognized it was God's gift to them, and that God had given it to them for a purpose. And in fulfilling that ultimate purpose, which was this gesture of love and compassion for their Muslim neighbors, they were really fulfilling not just God's purpose for them, but they were understanding at a deep level the heart of God in His sense of justice and what justice is really all about from his perspective that took them deeper in their relationship with God. And they've never regretted it. There's no sense in which they felt that they missed out on something. They still, as far as I know, to this day, don't have and never did replace the sound system. But they didn't feel it was necessary any longer. They felt the gospel had been communicated in an unexpected way. And they'd made their point, or more especially God had made his point. But he made it so that everyone understood his heart. For me, that story, that example, is very much about what I hope this course teaches. What we have comes to us from God. And if it does, the first question we need to ask ourselves is, why? For what purpose? In what way can the choices that I make with the things that God has given me touch his heart and show my desire to understand what is at the center of what concerns God?